Hello, my name is Amy Verdun and I'm here with Oliver Schmidtke from the University of Victoria to talk about migration, citizenship and security in the European Union. The EU first created explicit policies on migration, justice and security in the early 1990s. Today it calls this policy the area of freedom, security and justice, or AFSJ. What kinds of issues are governed under the AFSJ?
At first, if you look at it, you can say it's a very diverse set of policies brought together in this domain. And if you look at the three elements, first of all, there is security that relates to border security, migration, asylum, and so forth. There's justice, law enforcement, policing across the European Union. And last but not least, there's freedom, which relates to fundamental rights and entitlements that EU citizens have, partly and most importantly through the EU citizenship status. If you try to find a coherent link between these policy areas, you need to go to the increased sense of cross-border mobility within the European Union. And that has to do with key decisions the European Union took in the 1990s, the completion of the single market, the Schengen Agreement a bit later on that does away with border controls gradually within the European Union, and the Schengen zone. So in a way, what this domain does is to think about the implications of more and more people living and moving across borders, goods, services, and what this implies. And so that is the set of policies designed to address some of the challenges with a more and more integrated European Union.
Why is it seen as beneficial to have a European approach to these types of issues as opposed to just national approaches?
You could address this question from a functionalist perspective. Once you open up the borders and reduce controls, how do you respond to more and more people crossing? Think about migration, right? They enter the European Union at one point, but then it is outside of the control of individual member states to regulate migration. So you need a pan-European framework. And let me give you some more examples. Think about crime. You can't really stop money laundering, human trafficking, terrorist activities, because they operate at a European, if not global scale, right? So you need a coordinated response to make these policies effective. So here again, what you have is a more and more integrated European Union, more border crossing and more integration, and then you need policies that respond to this. Migration is another good example. Immigrants enter the European Union often at the external border, and then once they're in, it's hard to regulate. So in a way, you need a common policy to decide, is someone eligible for asylum? Who should come in? Whom do we select? How do we give out citizenship? So I think that needs to be regulated at the European level in response, again, to a kind of functionalist logic that is driving a more and more integrated European Union.
The most contentious part of the area of freedom, security and justice relates to borders, migration and security. Which structures has the EU set up in this area, and how have they been tested by the so-called refugee crisis?
Borders is indeed probably the most controversial element, border governance, in this domain. And if you think about it, it goes to the very core of what state sovereignty is and what the aspiration of a supranationalist approach is. So it speaks to issues of security, control, all those things that originally and traditionally have been assigned to individual nation states. And that, in a way, triggers also very controversial political debates. Think about Brexit. At the core of Great Britain leaving the European Union was a concern over control of borders. Who should be entitled to come in, who gets citizenship, and how do we exert our sovereign right to determine security at the border. And that also played out in the refugee crisis, when the European Union had a mechanism in place, a so-called Dublin Agreement, that asylum seekers that come into the European Union need to claim asylum status in the first EU member state they come to. But given the amount of people that came in 2015-16, partly due to the civil war in Syria, the European Union was simply overwhelmed with this very arrangement and needed to find a mechanism to distribute refugees more equitably across European member states. However, that was a situation when, again, the political controversy kicked in, and many member states said, no, we are not participating, we are closing our borders, and they left basically the European Union hanging and brought an end to the Dublin Agreement in its original format, and it showed the limited capacity of the European Union to impose a system of border control and governance of asylum that was up to the challenge in 2015-16.
In your view, what are the key challenges in implementing common policies in the area of freedom, security, and justice?
Fundamentally, and I spoke to this, issues of governing borders, migration speak to the key sense of what state sovereignty is all about. So it also speaks to issues of security, identity. And as such, it has proven to be a particularly difficult field as it also relates to the domestic arena. And what we've seen across Europe, partly due to the governments of borders, is the nationalist, populist backlash against attempts of the European Union to move these decisions into the supranational arena. In a way, you could relate this to what political scientists describe as the liberal paradox. On the one hand, European societies are fast aging, they need more immigrants, so in a way it is almost inevitable for them to recruit them. On the other hand, there's a political opposition against more immigrants. And this plays out at the domestic level, but also at the European level, where the European Union tries to promote also the recruitment of highly qualified immigrants. But at the domestic level, there's a very loud and noticeable opposition formed particularly by the resurgence of nationalism and populism across the continent.
The geographical location of Canada results in few border relations compared to the EU. Are there, nevertheless, any interesting insights or comparisons between Canadian border relations and EU border relations that can be made?
You mentioned the geography of Canada. Indeed, Canada is in a way protected by two oceans and a friendly border with the United States. So you don't have the same degree of irregular migration coming to Canada and needing to respond through a particular form of governance of borders. But we've seen those coming in as well. And Canada will not be exempt from the hard and difficult decision that the European Union had to make, which is to square on the one hand the protection of fundamental rights, the right to political asylum, on the other hand the security of borders. How do you come to a proper balance between these two goals? And Canada will have to make these difficult moral and political decisions as well. The second one is that Canada is not immune to the nationalist and populist backlash that we've seen in Europe. So far, there hasn't been really an anti-immigrant party in Canada, but we see at least signs of a more critical approach and some of the discourse that we see on the European continent informing debates in Canada. So we might see a similar political dynamic at some stage playing out. On a more positive note, there's definitely lots of room for policy learning, mutual policy learning, in particular considering how long-standing Canada's approach to governing migration, multiculturalism, dealing with cultural diversity is. And I think there is a very fruitful exchange of policy across the Atlantic in this respect, mostly learning from the Canadian experience of recruiting and integrating cohorts of immigrants throughout its modern history.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.